You think you know someone until they reveal their true identity. Those were the words that echoed in Maya Johnson's mind as she stood at the airport security checkpoint, her pulse slightly elevated. She had done nothing wrong, but the officer's eyes kept narrowing in suspicion as she approached. The air felt thick with tension as the officer gestured for her to step aside. Maya, calm as always, complied, though a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that she was being unfairly targeted. The airport, normally a bustling place full of hurried travelers, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. It wasn't unusual to be asked to step aside for a routine check, but this felt different. She could feel the officer's eyes scanning her, trying to piece together something that just didn't fit in his mind. Maybe it was her tailored navy blazer, or perhaps it was the way she held herself, confident, poised, like someone who knew their worth. But none of that should have mattered. After all, she was just another traveler on a business trip. Please open your bag, the officer instructed in a tone that was a little too firm for comfort. Maya gave him a nod and slowly unzipped her bag, aware of the people around her. She could feel their eyes on her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. She wasn't sure what made them stare. Was it the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman of color in a space where people like her weren't often seen in positions of power? Maya didn't let it show. She continued with the process, removing her laptop and the stack of documents inside her bag. But the officer wasn't satisfied. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me before I check your things?" he asked, his voice dripping with unspoken doubts. Maya met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of breaking her composure. She had faced prejudice before, but this time felt different. "No, I'm just on a business trip. Please feel free to check," she replied, her voice steady but firm. He didn't respond immediately, just glanced at his colleagues, who were whispering among themselves. The murmurs from other travelers were starting to rise, the situation quickly becoming uncomfortable. "We'll need to inspect your documents further," he said, motioning for her to step aside. Maya complied, not because she was afraid, but because she knew the protocol. What he didn't know was that Maya was not just a random businesswoman. She wasn't just another person waiting for a flight. Maya Johnson was the CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in the country, Innovation Tech. She had built a multi-billion-dollar company from the ground up, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. The officer's assumption was about to come crashing down. "Excuse me," she said, reaching into her bag and pulling out her company's official badge. The officer blinked, suddenly realizing his mistake. "This is your ID?" he stammered. "Yes, I'm the CEO of Innovation Tech," Maya replied, her tone calm, but carrying an air of authority that left no room for argument. A quiet gasp spread through the people nearby as the officer's face flushed with embarrassment. He had just made a huge mistake. Maya could see the realization dawning on him, but it was too late. He had already made his assumptions based solely on the color of her skin and her appearance. In that moment, Maya's calmness wasn't just a reflection of her poise. It was a reminder of the power of not letting prejudice define you. She was not here to teach a lesson, but the lesson was clear nonetheless. Never judge a book by its cover. The officer fumbled with his words, but there was nothing left to say. Maya picked up her bag, gave a polite nod to the crowd of onlookers, and walked away, her head held high. The silence in the air felt heavy, but in her heart, she knew that this moment was one step closer to creating a world where people were valued for who they truly were, not based on assumptions or stereotypes. Maya wasn't just a businesswoman. She was proof that no one could ever be reduced to the color of their skin or the assumptions others made about them. Ivy sat quietly in the terminal, watching the world bustle around her, the noise of rolling suitcases, announcements, and footsteps blending into a dull hum. She wasn't in a hurry, not yet. She had a couple of hours before her flight to Boston, a business trip that had kept her busy for weeks. She glanced at the time on her phone, a quick swipe of the screen revealing the same message from her assistant. "Meeting in Boston with potential investors. Be there early." Ivy sighed and set her phone down. She could already hear the subtle tension in her own voice as she said those words, potential investors. The weight of that responsibility had grown heavier over the years. As the CEO of her own tech company, Ivy was no stranger to pressure, but today felt different. Today felt like a test. The kind of test that wasn't just about business. It was about how she navigated the world, the one she fought so hard to be a part of. As she stood up to stretch her legs, she caught the eye of a security officer who had been watching her from the corner of her eye. She smiled politely, but his gaze lingered. Something about the way he looked at her, as though she didn't quite fit the environment, made Ivy feel uneasy. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered that look. The look that said, "You don't belong here." She wasn't a stranger to it, even in a space as commonplace as an airport. She had spent years fighting against assumptions, against the notion that her skin color or her appearance could define her worth. But even now, as an accomplished woman with an impeccable track record, she still found herself on the receiving end of looks like that. Still, she brushed it off and continued walking towards the gate. The officer, now standing near the security check, called out to her, "Excuse me, miss, can you step aside for a quick check?" Ivy paused, but didn't flinch. This wasn't unusual. After all, it was routine, right? Just another moment of her day where she had to follow the rules. But the way he said it, it was sharp, almost pointed. "Sure," Ivy replied, her voice calm. As she moved to the side, she could feel eyes on her. Several passengers glanced over, some of them outright staring, their curiosity unmasked. She felt a flicker of irritation but suppressed it. This wasn't about them, she reminded herself. It was about doing what she needed to do. The officer began to inspect her belongings, his hands moving over her bag methodically. "Is everything in order here, miss?" he asked, though it sounded more like an accusation than an inquiry. Ivy didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gave a polite smile and nodded. She knew the routine, but this felt different. Why the extra attention? Why the scrutiny? She could feel herself bracing for something she couldn't quite name, something she didn't want to acknowledge but knew was coming. A few minutes passed in silence, but Ivy's calm demeanor remained. Then the officer spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper, but enough for Ivy to catch the hint of skepticism. "Are you sure you're in the right terminal, ma'am? Your flight's about to board in a different gate." Ivy's eyebrows furrowed for a moment. She wasn't sure whether it was his tone or the words that made her feel so exposed, but she straightened up and calmly glanced at the gate number on her ticket. "I'm on the right one. Just a bit of a mix-up. Thank you for your diligence." She made sure her voice was firm, no room for doubt, no room for him to question her further. The officer's expression shifted, but not in a way that made her feel more comfortable. It was a flicker of something, embarrassment, perhaps, or surprise, but Ivy wasn't interested in speculating. She was ready to move on. As the officer began to clear her, she couldn't help but feel the eyes on her again, this time with more intensity. She gathered her things and headed toward her gate, keeping her chin lifted, her back straight. She was no stranger to moments like this, moments when the world tried to remind her that she didn't quite belong, that she wasn't what they expected. But Ivy knew better. She had spent years climbing, proving herself, and she wasn't about to let anyone's assumptions define her path. As she sat at her gate, waiting for her flight, she couldn't help but reflect on the years it had taken to get here, to a place where she was no longer fighting for recognition but for respect. Respect not because of her title or her accomplishments, but because of her unwavering belief in herself. And as the plane boarded, Ivy stood, ready to move forward once again, her journey just beginning. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her worth was already settled. The flight to Boston was a quiet one, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to Ivy's thoughts as she sat by the window. The sky outside was clear, stretching endlessly in shades of blue. She had been traveling often these past few months, the pressure of her growing company weighing heavily on her shoulders. But as she looked out at the clouds below, she felt a moment of peace, a rare breath of fresh air amid the chaos. She reached into her bag and pulled out her tablet, scanning through her meeting agenda for the next day. Investors, business partnerships, product launches, it was all becoming a blur. But Ivy wasn't the kind of woman to back down from challenges. She had worked hard to get to this point, and she wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, derail her progress. As she was lost in her thoughts, the flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. Ivy politely declined, her focus still on the upcoming meeting. The rest of the flight seemed to pass in a blur of time zones and quiet hums, until the captain's voice came over the intercom, signaling their descent into Boston. Ivy's heart quickened slightly. It was always like this before a big presentation, nervous excitement mixed with the knowledge that she had prepared for this moment for months. The plane touched down smoothly, and she was on her way out of the terminal, her mind already shifting into business mode. But as she approached the baggage claim area, something unexpected happened. Ivy noticed a familiar face standing near the carousel. It was the same officer from the airport earlier that morning, the one who had questioned her at security. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, airports were busy, and people passed by each other all the time. But then, she saw him look at her, and this time, his gaze wasn't one of suspicion or doubt. It was different, almost respectful. Ivy hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected to run into him again. The officer, noticing her pause, took a step forward, his expression a mix of surprise and mild embarrassment. I didn't mean to give you a hard time earlier," he said, his voice a little hesitant, as though he was trying to find the right words. Ivy raised an eyebrow, not entirely sure where this conversation was headed. "I understand," she said, keeping her tone neutral but polite. "It's not every day that you see someone who doesn't fit the usual profile." There it was again, the assumption, the unspoken recognition of her difference. Ivy didn't let it show, though. She had long ago learned the art of maintaining composure in situations like these. "It's okay," she said, her smile genuine. "I've had my fair share of misunderstandings before." The officer nodded, a sheepish smile crossing his face. "You know, I didn't know who you were at first," he said, clearly regretting his earlier assumptions. Ivy couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Not because she had won, she didn't need to win, but because his change in attitude was proof of something she already knew, that her worth wasn't determined by what others expected of her. "I guess I don't fit the mold, do I?" she replied, her voice light, but with an underlying edge of truth. "No, not at all," the officer admitted, his voice quiet. "I've learned something today, that's for sure." Ivy gave him a nod, picking up her luggage from the carousel. "We all learn," she said, her tone casual but laced with the wisdom of someone who had been on the receiving end of judgment for too long. She walked past him, her stride confident and purposeful. As she left the baggage claim area and stepped into the busy Boston airport, Ivy realized that, in a strange way, her encounter with the officer had reminded her of something important. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. The world could judge her, assume things about her, but she knew the truth. She was powerful not because of the job title she held, but because of the strength she carried within herself. And that, Ivy knew, was something no one could take away from her. Ivy's meeting with the investors had gone as smoothly as she had hoped. The room was filled with sharp suits, quiet murmurs, and the clicking of pens on notepads. But despite the professional atmosphere, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this day than just numbers and projections. As she wrapped up the final part of her presentation, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu, like a chapter in a book she had read before, yet couldn't quite remember. The investors seemed impressed, their smiles suggesting approval, but the truth was, Ivy knew what they really cared about: results. The conversation shifted to financial projections, market trends, and the strategies that would lead to success. As she answered their questions with the same confidence she had used when building her company from the ground up, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The woman who had walked into that airport just a few days ago, uncertain of the judgments waiting for her, was no longer the same woman sitting in front of these investors. She had learned to navigate the complex world of business, but also the world that existed outside the boardroom, the one filled with assumptions, biases, and prejudice. As the meeting concluded and the investors shook her hand, offering words of praise, Ivy couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came from knowing she had faced the very thing that had once tried to hold her back and had come out stronger for it. The next few days passed in a blur of negotiations, paperwork, and emails. But Ivy's thoughts kept returning to that moment in the airport when the officer had approached her, not with the usual professionalism, but with something more, something that showed growth on both sides. She thought about the lessons learned, not just in business, but in life. The world didn't always make it easy for her, but Ivy had learned to thrive in the face of challenges, to turn every obstacle into an opportunity. She had faced the stereotypes, the doubts, and the prejudice, and had risen above it. By the time she boarded her return flight, she felt an unexpected sense of pride. The world had tried to put her in a box, to limit her to what they thought she could achieve, but she had broken out of it, and in doing so, had redefined what success looked like. As the plane lifted off the ground, heading back to her home city, Ivy stared out the window, watching the city below shrink into the distance. She had achieved what she set out to do, and yet, she knew this was only the beginning. The path ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next. She was no longer just a woman in a suit, a businesswoman with a title. She was Ivy Johnson, a force in her own right, determined to make her mark on the world. And nothing, not prejudice, not assumptions, not even doubt, was going to stop her. Ivy stepped off the plane, feeling the familiar rush of cool air as she entered the bustling airport. The return trip had been smooth, but her thoughts remained clouded. She had accomplished what she set out to do: impress the investors, secure the deal, and push her company one step closer to the future she had envisioned. Yet, in the quiet moments during the flight back, her mind kept drifting to the events at the airport, to the officer, to the subtle shift in his demeanor. It was a reminder of how much had changed, both in her life and in how the world saw her. She had spent years building a reputation based on competence, resilience, and ambition. But that morning, standing in the face of assumption and bias, Ivy had come to realize something crucial. Success wasn't just about achieving professional milestones. It was about navigating the unseen barriers, the ones that people like her faced every day. Barriers that didn't come with clear obstacles, but with expectations and stereotypes. As she made her way to the baggage claim, she found herself reflecting on the countless times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or misjudged. But each time, she had risen above, proving that her worth wasn't tied to anyone else's perception of her. She had spent years breaking down those walls, building herself up in spaces where others thought she didn't belong. And now, she was about to enter the next phase of her journey, one where the stakes were higher and the challenges more complex. Ivy picked up her luggage, her fingers gripping the handle with a quiet determination. There was no time to dwell on the past. She had work to do. As she left the terminal and stepped into the bright afternoon light, her phone buzzed with a new notification. A message from her assistant, a reminder of the meeting with her team later that afternoon. The familiar weight of responsibility settled back onto her shoulders, but this time, it didn't feel as heavy. Ivy knew she was ready for whatever came next. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She had faced down prejudice, doubts, and limitations, and now she was standing at the edge of something bigger. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let anything stop her. She glanced at her phone again, smiling at the message from her assistant. "Great job today, Ivy. The team is looking forward to hearing from you." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had made it this far, and now, there was no going back. The future was waiting, and it was hers for the taking. Ivy's meeting with her team was an exhilarating experience. The room buzzed with energy as ideas flew across the table. She had spent the past few days preparing for this, and it showed. The presentation went smoothly, with Ivy confidently outlining her vision for the company's next steps. The team members, inspired by her clear direction and passion, seemed more than ready to tackle the upcoming challenges. It felt good to be in control, to know exactly what needed to be done to push the company forward. As the meeting ended and people began filing out, Ivy lingered for a moment, lost in thought. She felt the weight of responsibility settling back onto her shoulders. This was the life she had chosen, and while it came with its pressures, it also came with the satisfaction of knowing she was building something that mattered. The next few days passed in a blur of strategy sessions, conference calls, and quick decisions. But through it all, Ivy kept a steady focus. There was still a long road ahead, and she knew that her success wasn't just about making the right decisions in the boardroom. It was about continuing to prove herself in the world outside of it. The world where assumptions still existed, where biases still lingered, and where people like her had to fight just to be seen. As the weeks passed, Ivy found herself reflecting more on the officer at the airport, the way his attitude had shifted when he realized who she was. It wasn't just a personal victory for her. It was a reminder of how far she had come. The challenges she faced were no longer about proving herself to others. They were about continuing to break down barriers, to show that anyone, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like, could achieve greatness. Ivy's confidence had grown stronger with each passing day, but so had her awareness of the work that still needed to be done. She couldn't change the world overnight, but she could change the way people saw her, and, in doing so, inspire them to change the way they saw others. As the months went by, Ivy's company grew, and so did her influence. She wasn't just a business leader. She was a role model for others who had faced the same obstacles she had. She started receiving invitations to speak at conferences, to mentor young women in the tech industry, and to share her story. But even with all of this recognition, Ivy never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the look in the officer's eyes when he realized who she was. She knew that every small victory mattered, and that each one was another step toward a future where people like her were no longer underestimated. One afternoon, as Ivy sat in her office, going over some new data, her assistant walked in with a message. It was from the officer at the airport, who had somehow found a way to contact her. The message was simple. "I just wanted to apologize again for my behavior at the airport. I've thought a lot about it since then, and I want you to know I've learned a lot from our encounter. Thank you for your patience and understanding." Ivy stared at the message for a moment, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She typed a quick reply. "Thank you for your message. I believe we all have something to learn every day. Best of luck with everything." As she hit send, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The officer's apology wasn't just about him. It was about a moment that had changed both of their lives in ways they hadn't expected. Ivy had faced prejudice and doubt her entire life, but she had never let it define her. She had turned those experiences into lessons, not just for herself, but for others. And that, she realized, was the real power she held. Her ability to inspire change, to challenge assumptions, and to build a world where anyone, regardless of their background, could succeed. Ivy's world was changing in ways she had never expected. She had always been driven, always had a clear vision of where she wanted to go. But now, things were starting to shift, not just for her company, but for herself as a person. As the weeks passed, she found herself getting more involved in initiatives she never thought she would. She had always focused on business, on success, numbers, and growth. But now, she was speaking at events, mentoring young women, and becoming a voice for change in a world that still clung to old prejudices. It wasn't easy. The pressure to perform, to be the example, was immense. But as Ivy watched the younger generation look up to her, to see the hope in their eyes as they sought her advice, she realized something. She was no longer just building a company. She was building a legacy that had the power to shape not just her future, but the future of countless others who would follow in her footsteps. One evening, after a long day of meetings and strategy calls, Ivy sat in her office alone. The sun had set, and the city lights below flickered in the distance. For the first time in a while, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about all the obstacles she had overcome, the doubts, the skepticism, the moments when she had felt like an outsider in her own industry. She thought about the officer at the airport, the way he had apologized, and the subtle shift in how she had seen the world. She realized that those moments weren't just challenges to be faced. They were opportunities to teach, to show others that their assumptions were wrong. That, despite what they believed, people like her had the power to rise above, to defy the expectations placed on them. As Ivy gazed out of her office window, she thought about her next steps. She had already accomplished so much, but there was still more to be done. She wasn't ready to slow down. She couldn't afford to. The world was changing, and she wanted to be a part of that change. She wanted to be the one who inspired others to believe in themselves, to know that they could achieve greatness, no matter where they came from or what others thought of them. Ivy stood up, walking over to her desk and picking up a letter that had been left for her earlier in the day. It was from one of her mints, a young woman who had just landed her first job in the tech industry. The letter was full of gratitude and excitement, thanking Ivy for the guidance she had offered. As Ivy read the words, a smile spread across her face. This was why she did it. This was why she kept pushing forward, why she kept breaking down barriers. For moments like this, for the next generation of women who would one day look back and say, "She made it possible for me." Ivy placed the letter down and sat back in her chair. She wasn't just a businesswoman anymore. She was a mentor, a leader, and a symbol of what could happen when you refuse to let the world define you. And as she looked at the city lights below, she knew that her journey was far from over. It had only just begun. Ivy stood by the window, her eyes scanning the city below. It had been a few months since she had signed the deal with the investors, and in that time, things had moved quickly. Her company was growing, her influence expanding, and she was doing it all with a sense of purpose she had never fully understood until now. The morning light reflected off the skyscrapers, casting a soft glow on everything beneath. Ivy had spent countless hours building her empire, navigating through obstacles and barriers that many never saw. But now, as the CEO of a leading tech company, she felt something else stirring within her. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It wasn't just about achieving success in the traditional sense. It was about creating a legacy that would change the way people thought about leadership, about success, about identity. She turned away from the window and glanced at the photos on her desk. There were pictures of her family, moments of joy and togetherness, but also images of her as a young woman, just starting out, unsure of herself, unsure of the world around her. Those early years had been filled with doubt, but also with determination. Ivy had learned to push through the noise, to ignore the assumptions others made about her because of her race, her gender, or her background. But now, she was at the top of her game, and she could see things differently. She could see how much had changed in the industry, how the voices of women like her were becoming louder, more respected. And yet, she also saw how much still needed to be done. The tech world was still dominated by men, still fraught with barriers for women, especially women of color. But Ivy was no longer afraid of those challenges. She was ready to take them on, not just for herself, but for the generations to come. As she prepared for her next meeting, Ivy took a deep breath, centering herself. There was still work to be done, but she had learned one important lesson. Success wasn't just about achieving personal goals. It was about making a difference, about being a voice for those who were still fighting for their place in the world. The next few years would be crucial, not just for her company, but for the industry at large. Ivy had already started mentoring young women in tech, offering them the guidance and support she never had when she was starting out. She wanted to see more women at the table, more voices heard, more diverse perspectives leading the charge. She wanted to be part of a world where people were judged not by their skin color or gender, but by their ability to create, to innovate, to lead. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a message from her assistant reminding her of the meeting with the board later that day. Ivy smiled to herself. It was time. She wasn't just walking into that room as the CEO of a successful tech company. She was walking in as someone who had faced the odds, who had defied expectations, and who had changed the game. She was walking in as a leader, and nothing, not bias, not prejudice, not doubt, was going to stand in her way. Ivy had just left another successful meeting. The board had approved the new product launch, and everything was moving forward as planned. Yet, despite the accomplishment, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she needed to do. As she walked through the sleek corridors of the office building, her thoughts kept drifting back to the core values that had gotten her here: hard work, perseverance, and, above all, the belief that she could change the narrative. The world she had entered wasn't just about innovation and business deals. It was about creating opportunities for others, especially for those who had been overlooked. Ivy had always believed that success should be about lifting others up, not just climbing to the top alone. That was why she had dedicated time to mentoring young women, to showing them that they too could break through the barriers that had once held her back. As Ivy passed the glass walls of the meeting rooms, she saw her team hard at work. There was a sense of camaraderie among them, a shared vision that drove their progress. She had worked tirelessly to build a team that reflected her own values: diverse, driven, and united by a common goal. She couldn't help but smile as she thought about how far they had come. But even as the company flourished, Ivy knew that there was still much to be done. The road to change wasn't short, and it certainly wasn't easy. She had been fortunate to break through some of the obstacles that had been put in her path, but she knew there were still people in the world who would never see her as she truly was: capable, intelligent, and worthy. She had been the subject of skepticism and doubt for most of her life, but she had learned how to use it to fuel her drive. She wasn't just out to prove something to others. She was proving it to herself. As Ivy stepped into her office, she felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. Her success was not just about numbers on a balance sheet or market share. It was about the legacy she would leave behind. It was about showing the next generation that they could achieve anything they set their minds to, no matter where they came from or what obstacles they faced. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began to type a message to the young women she mentored. She encouraged them to keep pushing forward, to keep believing in themselves, and to never let anyone define their potential. She reminded them that they were capable of achieving anything. Ivy leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. She had built something extraordinary, but she wasn't finished yet. The journey she had started years ago was far from over. There were more battles to fight, more voices to amplify, and more lives to impact. The future was bright, and Ivy was ready to face it head-on. She had broken down the walls that once held her back, and now, she was building bridges for others to cross. She was not just creating a company. She was changing the world, one step at a time.